on the Hebrew letters. They're a kind of ekphrastic poetry.
Totally. Yeah.
And so I thought we could start by hearing one of those poems based on the Hebrew letters, and we'll draw on that to lead our way into our conversation. And so I'd love it if you'd be willing to read the poem based on the Hebrew letter Vav.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just read the poem first, and without saying anything about the whole project of these letters and this particular letter. Vav, for Jeffrey Hartman in memoriam. This upright letter bows its head ever so slightly out of humility, much like Jeffrey. Toward the page, it's fixed itself, too, as though by a hook, or being hooked, really a summoning from within it or him to listen hard to what's barely there and maybe not quite yet between the lines, to sit, taking a stand and read, learning straightness and when to bend. So we come not to the end, but once again and again to and.
Wow. I love this poem so much. And as you know, I recently included a short piece of prose that I wrote. I have lots of questions for you about the poem, but I thought maybe we could start by you talking a little bit about what drew you to writing this group of poems based on the Hebrew letters. And maybe even before you begin telling us about that, I'll note that I love how this series draws our attention to like one of the most fundamental elements of writing itself. And I know these poems are about way more than just writing, but the letter, we might think about the phoneme, we might think about the word, we might think about the phrase, but everything begins, at least with a written text, with the letter itself. And this book has so much to do
Right.
beginnings as well. So so would you talk a little bit about the project and
Yeah, I mean, kind of everything is in what you just said. You said so much there, and so with so few words. And you've used the word drawn 3 times already. Not to make you self-conscious or me self-conscious about it, but there's some kind of this notion of the drawing that's in desire is so central to everything in this book, and the book is in some ways just a kind of grand homage, or trying to do some justice to the centrality of that, the vectors, the tension involved in drawing of all sorts, in being drawn. So the project of dealing with the letters as a whole, I mean, we started out talking, obviously you're at the Black Mountain College Museum Library now, and Black Mountain was itself a place that, or its writers and artists and dancers were, for me, kind of such a beacon. They really were the people who showed me an alternative way in poetry out of the kind of received tradition. I mean, although that is already can be a received tradition at this point, but at least the received tradition that I was finding myself in as an undergraduate. And of course, one of the things that the artists and painters and dancers and poets and novelists did at Black Mountain was sort of knock down the barriers between the different arts. And not that they were the first to do that, but they were fierce about it and totally open and wild about it. And that's always been a big inspiration for me deep down. My mother was a Martha Graham dancer. Not that that was a major presence in my life growing up, but I think from the beginning, from early on, I was getting a lot of this kind of trickle down mixing of the arts, dance and music, and the visual and the verbal. And Hebrew letters have always had this kind of tremendous resonance around them for me, as I know they have for you, as pretty much for any Jew, whether or not they're observant Jew or anybody who's had the least bit of exposure to traditional Judaism understands the power, just that kind of force field that's around the letters, the Hebrew letters. And that has, I think that imprinted itself on me long before I ever thought of myself as a writer or an aspiring artist or anything like that. And at a certain point in my writing life, maybe it was, well, one of the first poems in the first poem in my first book is called Alphabet. It starts away, cut to the letter. And then there's another poem in that first book it's called Torches. And a night the letters fell from the wall, like startled minnows shimmering. And so from the very beginning, I had this, and that was a dream. I've had this preoccupation with all letters, starting with Hebrew letters, but by extension to letters of all alphabets, especially English. I've learned some modern Greek also. It's been a big thrill to be inside those letters. It's been such a central presence that at a certain point, it's just like the penny dropped, and I just wanted to, again, pay homage, do justice, see if I could translate that intense, complicated feeling I have for a foreign alphabet that's largely opaque for most people and may have absolutely no affective sort of valence or cloud around it. See if I could translate that feeling into an English that would be accessible to the general reader of poetry. Granted, the general reader of poetry is already not a general reader at this point, and certainly of my poetry. But could it be accessible? You know, could I make that translation? What William Carlos Williams called could I make that necessary translation from my local, which is very much not an American Williams-esque local, right? It's a kind of abstract, graphic local on the page or in the imagination when you're talking about letters, into the American vernacular or English poetry. And so I just sort of set myself that challenge. I think it started, the actual trigger was, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I was reading some poems by another poet, which, you know, many translations begin with dissatisfaction with other people's translations. That's just a fact. It begins also with a love for the original, right? What is it? Humboldt says a modest love for the original and the study born of that love. That's what he says translation comes from. Modest love and study born of that love. And so I was reading some poems and I thought, well, just how rare it is that I'm drawn into, there's that word again, the force field of poems when people are writing about the Hebrew letters. Although I have seen some interesting poems about Japanese letters, for example. So I just wanted to try it and sort of mapped out a game plan. Let's do something. You know, I think I don't know if I started with Aleph, with the beginning of the alphabet, but I started near the beginning. And the idea was to spend a lot of time with each letter and the history of commentary on these letters and the history of my own sort of associations with these letters, and just sort of dwell in that space in the same way that when I'm writing poems, if I'm writing poems about Terry Winter's drawings, or if I'm in Jerusalem and writing poems about the landscape there, or whatever, I often will kind of frame a field, a subject matter, the field of a subject matter, and then just spend time in that field just keep I'm just there for a long time, let things happen and see what happens. But also a kind of Black Mountain ethos. And so I did that with the letters, and I treated them sometimes as visual stimulants, sometimes as memory stimulants, it's catalysts. Sometimes I would be drawing on the fairly vast body of Jewish commentary on these letters. I just would, again, soak myself in it, let these things sort of seep into me. And then at a certain point, I would feel a kind of critical mass and I would improvise. And it's not that I wouldn't revise the improvisation, but basically whatever came out in that first improvisation, that was the subject. That was the way the poem, the basic outlines of the poem. And in this case with Vav, which means and in Hebrew, but you don't have to know that at all. Right? That's the whole point. Is I didn't want anybody to have to know anything. There was just this gong was hit at the beginning, whatever. I say there's this name, it may mean the name of the letter, may mean nothing. And let's see what happens, what comes out. And what came out here totally surprised me, as it pretty much did with all these poems. Jeffrey Hartman. I was not thinking about Jeffrey Hartman in the slightest when I sat down to write. Hartman, who was one of the great literary critics, scholars of the second half of the 20th century, primarily a Wordsworth scholar, a German Jewish refugee who became a Wordsworth scholar, kind of strange thing, but not that strange given who else was around in those days. And I knew him a little bit when I came to Yale. We were not close, but I got to know him very quickly, and he had asked me to read one of his cultural memoir, which was in manuscript, and to sort of help him vet that. And there was a connection, and there was a strong connection. And he's also written a lot about Jewish literature. And so he just popped into mind. I don't know. I think it was, I began with the visual sense of the Vav as a letter that's an upright letter that has a little curl or a hook at the top. Vav also means hook. And that came up the word humility, and that gave me the word Jeffrey. And the next thing you know, there was a portrait of Jeffrey Hartman. And that's pretty much what I did with all the poems. I would just sort of let some kind of stimulation, provocation, spark of the moment take over and see where it would go.
Mm. Wow, thank you for that. The last thing you were talking about was humility, maybe gave you the word Jeffrey. And so I'm guessing that it's also the sounds, the music of the language that leads you from one word to another, from one moment to another in your improvisational mode of composition. So I have like a million questions now to ask you based on what you just shared. I do want to get to the question about improvisation, like what does that mean for you in part of your own writing practice? What does it mean to improvise? So maybe let's start there, and then I'll back up and get some questions that occurred to me earlier. Let's start. And improvisation was so important to the artists, working at Black Mountain College as well.
So the improvisation here especially, but I think in general for me in composition, descends from a listening to the sounds, to the weights, right? A kind of synesthetic engagement with language, so that language is experienced for me visual, in terms of visual image, in terms of sound, in terms of choreographic properties and balance, shifting of balance, in terms of texture. All these things are critical for me in everything I do, in the translations and in my own poems. This book has an epigraph from the Zohar, which is sort of the mystical scripture of Kabbalah. It's a commentary on the Bible proper, but it's the Bible broken open kaleidoscopically as if on a kind of LSD. And in the Zohar to the Song of Songs, the biblical Song of Songs, the rabbis who are writing this part of the Zohar are looking at the world before it was created. What was in the world before it was created? There's God, and there's the 22 Hebrew letters, and then there are some other divine, the divine forces of the forces of divine consciousness and the 22 letters. And out of those 22 letters, the world is created. So that's already a kind of improvisational matrix of a very charged and high order. But what it says in the Zohar is you had letters that were male and you had letters that were female. And they do what male and female does and do. And they say, it says in the Zohar, each letter called saying, draw me after you, let us run. Right? In the book, in the Song of Songs, it's the male lover, the female lover calls to the male lover, draw me after you, let us run, right? And to go outside. And here it's the letters that are calling to each other. And I think all of the kind of improvisation that I'm doing, again, improvisation with revision and reworking, but the nugget, the core of improvisation comes out of that wanting to be drawn, openness to being drawn, openness to seeing where things draw you, to listening for the letters calling. And that's also the deep pleasure for me of reading poetry and frankly of looking at visual art. I think with a lot of the work in this book, but I've worked with visual artists, you know, as with the letters, I often do that kind of secretly. I'll be looking at a work of art and that will give rise to something, a sound. And so seeing will often give rise to a kind of hearing. And I'm trying to translate from sense to sense in the same way that I was trying to translate from the experience of the Hebrew letters to an English poem. So that kind of riding that wave of feeling. There's also an Agnes Martin poem in this book. Same kind of thing. Like the most delicate registrations on the canvas of Agnes Martin were something, and shifts of texture and of color were things that for me are analogous to the experience of reading and therefore also of composition, how these tiny changes in words lead to these enormous changes in consciousness. I mean, that's everything for me. And that's another kind of thing that I wanted to pay homage to, do justice to. In a previous book, I have an homage to another sort of Black Mountain or para-Black Mountain guy, Morton Feldman, the composer, and plays especially his works for piano, which are they're almost just like drops of water falling on into a cup or a different shape receptacle, and what slowly emerges, the kind of grandeur that emerges from Marjorie Perloff calls it in a recent book of hers, the infra-thin. She's taking Duchamp's idea, the infra-thin registration of things and changes that are rung on things. So yeah, all those are things that I'm trying to, the poem is a kind of trap almost, or it's a field in which I can catch those sensations and let them run with each other like the letters and see where they take me.
Incredible. We recently had a performance by a string quartet called Jack Quartet. They're kind of a world-renowned quartet, and a pianist. They performed a work by Morton Feldman here in the museum just a few weeks ago, suite for piano and strings. I think it was a late work. We were with a friend, I don't know, a week or two before that performance, who told us his wife doesn't like that kind of music because there are not enough notes. There weren't a lot, there were plenty of notes, there weren't a lot of notes, but they were so subtly and carefully controlled and drawn out with such concentration. I mean, hearing the music is one thing, and then watching the musicians, the level of attention to detail and the kind of fine nuance of drawing the bow across the string, and that subtle communication between the pianist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It makes me think of that kind of infra-thin communication that you were just talking about, that Marjorie Perloff named. So, what you've just said is a natural segue to go to one of the poems based on Terry Winters. But before we get there, you had talked about how at Black Mountain College was one of the places where artists were very much dedicated to breaking down barriers between the arts. And, when I heard you use that word barriers, it made me think of a lot of the poems in this book, including the poem Vov that you just read, which poem is very much about reading and the intimacy of reading. But there's also that kind of subtle play between where is the text and where is the reader? Where is the letter and where is the page and where is the word? And the barriers being almost kind of permeable between one and another. And you also, mentioned that in terms of working on this project, one of the things you took into consideration as you were reflecting on the letters, each of the letters, was the history of commentary on letters. And so when I read this poem that really emphasizes not the end, but the and, by the way, talk about an infra-thin.
Exactly.
From end to end.
What a world of difference. Yeah.
Oh man. And
a lifetime. Steve Reich has this piece called Proverbs.
Yeah.
Proverb. It's based on the Wittgenstein. How small a thought it takes to build a whole life. End to end. End to end. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Well, I think about, reading that poem Vov from a Jewish perspective with a awareness of and a little bit of knowledge of the kind of never ending role of commentary from century to century to century to century, just not exactly open-ended because it's all grounded in the text, but the text seems to yield more and more and more with each new humble, attentive reading of that text.
Yeah, I think that's totally germane, and again, not leaning on the traditional elements because that's not available to a lot of people who'd be reading the poems, but that's a profound thing. And the older I get, the more meaningful I find that, and maybe the more I feel that I understand it and didn't understand it quite when I was younger and wanted to, and sort of follow that line out, which is there is no text without the reader. There really is. That's one of the things about Jeffrey, like, is what his readings of Wordsworth, were they there before he saw them? The invention is discovery. That's also Olson, right? Historian, to find out for oneself.
Yeah.
If you're not there, if you're not present there as a reader, there is no poem. And that is a very subtle and important thing to keep in mind, and not just in poems, it's in anything, right? But yeah, and that kind of, that's a sort of abstract idea, but it's also then translated into the most concrete of relationships constantly in our lives. And that's, again, that's the kind of thing I wanted these poems to celebrate, to commemorate, to bear witness to.
Yeah. And as you write in Vov, to listen hard to what's barely there and maybe not quite yet between the lines, that kind of listening that a good reader, an attentive reader has to do. And similar to the kind of listening that I think you just said you have to do as a poet, to listen to the words, to listen to the letters, to see where they're drawing you and to allow yourself to be drawn. So talking about drawing, why don't we turn now to a poem or two from the Terry Winters
Sure.
piece. And so I think maybe number 6 from the
Yeah.
Terry.
Yeah. And Maybe I'll show what this drawing looks like. Again, as with the letters, I don't think one needs to see the drawing in order to experience the poem and to enjoy the poem. In fact, in this particular book, the drawing in black and white, although it's a color drawing, appears on the back side of the page. So when you get to the poem, you just read the poem, and then afterwards you see. But it can go either way. So here, let me just share the screen quickly here. So this is what this looks like. And this whole project started with Terry asking me, I actually asked him 2 books ago, a book called The Invention of Influence. I asked him if I could use a print of his as a cover, for the cover, and he was very gracious about that. And little by little, we struck up a relationship and became friends. And then at a certain point, he asked me if I would write about a show he was having, a big show at the Drawing Center in New York. And so I spent a lot of time with his drawings in preparation for that, and ended up doing a series of poems. So here's the poem, 6. And this series is called On Being Drawn. This writing's on and off the wall and tells us what it is and why we're so intent on understanding a layered saying that seems to say it all and nothing in particular, just like everything seen by those who know. It shows at best the whole in part that grows with the telling and spell dangling in between, like someone listening into a certain sort of uncertainty, speaking of uncertainty as a song of songs tangled truly in our being, led along a luminous line, singed and fringe within the singing, seeing us through. So there's Song of Songs again. And but yeah.
No, incredible. And so, one of the first of all, it's wonderful to get to see this image in color. In the book, the images are in black and white. Very powerful having the images in the book, but seeing them in color really opens them up even more to a viewer. And interesting to me, among many other things, is the very beginning of the poem, because here you are writing a poem in response to a drawing, and you characterize it from the first 3 syllables of the poem as writing the writing. And of course, there's the wordplay of the writings on and off the wall. And so I wonder, what are some of the similarities and differences that you experience as a viewer and a reader when you encounter a text, written in verbal language, and a drawing such as this one by Terry Winters? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, in some senses, that goes back to that that synesthetic leaping between the senses, right? And the first line of the poem that you quoted, this writing's on and off the wall. So I am looking at a drawing and talking about it, but I'm also, as with all these things, with the Hebrew letters, you don't have to know. So you don't have to know that there's what the drawing is. This writing that I'm doing is also on and off the wall. Like it could be on the shelf on the wall, and it's also off the wall in the sense of, let's face it, this is ridiculous. This whole enterprise, this, making something, who was it who said to you about the Morton Feldman, not enough notes? And people, I've been at the Agnes Martin exhibitions where somebody, a member of my family, would say, that's ridiculous, the child could do it, that kind of thing. And the same with this. What is this? This is a doodle, and yet for me, all kinds of things are start to come out of it when I pay attention to it. And the experience I have looking at it is extremely complicated and very much like my experience of reading a poem. So writing, how is a drawing like this writing for me? Well, writing, especially writing poetry, but I mean, all writing, any sort of non-purely informational writing, is filled and resonant with pre-semantic, charged with pre-semantic activity, meaning, not meaning per se, not just meaning, activity. It's in motion, it's dynamic, it's explosive, it's dangerous, could be boring. But that pre-semantic quality of writing a verbal art, of using words, is just so important to me. And it's so important to my experience of language in the world and language with other people and with friends. And, you know, think about with friends or with students or with members of your family and a spouse, how often we focus in not on what somebody said, what the meaning is, but we detect other meanings because there's some sort of tonal variation that we pick up on. And that's what that's how I see this as writing. This is a kind of analog to what the verbal arts do before we get to the translation into meaning and information. And so I learn and experience a ton of, in a sense, this returns me, spending time with art like this returns me to that much more sensory, primary, pre-semantic experience of the drawn gesture, which then can become a letter too, and then it can become 2 letters and 3 letters and a word and sentences, and, you know, Rilke, you must change your life. So in a nutshell, I think that's sort of what the analog is for me. And it provides just uncomplicated, or not uncomplicated, it provides a kind of basic pleasure that, as a poet and somebody who, you know, words are complicated in all kinds of other ways. This is a kind of focusing in on a more sensory dimension, which I find both deeply pleasurable and then also salutary, useful, and good for what ails my art, shall we say.
Beautiful. You know, I love that, thinking about the pre-semantic activity. And again, thinking about this from a Jewish perspective, sort of, you know, mainstream, typical, normative Judaism and Jewish experience is so heavily based on language, on semantic activity. And yet, you know, the very midrash or portion of the Zohar that you use as your epigraph, you know, to the book, you know, makes me think like, okay, yeah, we get Bereshit, we get Genesis. That's after the pre-semantic activity in the consciousness of whatever existed before. And there were letters, but there weren't necessarily words. Language hadn't yet come into being. And as I think about, you know, that passage from Zohar, and I'm looking at this drawing right now, I'm thinking, yeah, that's what existed before Bereshit bara et Elohim Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. I don't know that I'm quoting that exactly correctly, but I'm close.
Yeah.
In a beginning.
Well, there's also, Rick, as long as you're talking about all that.
Yeah.
So one of the other sort of Kabbalistic things that I buried in this book is, and I don't think you and I have discussed this at all, is the very first words of the book. The poem is called, the poem begins, wanting song in the beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
It's Eden Song is the poem. Wanting song in the beginning to end. So the semantic level is obviously desiring song. So there's that calling and all that. There's maybe wanting in the sense of missing song and going to look for it. But then there's also, and this again, you don't have to know, but this is, since we're talking about this, the normative semantic, pre-semantic, post-semantic, polysemantic, polymorphous experience of all these things. The word Bereshit in the beginning, one way of translating it, which you just quoted from the beginning of Genesis, if you take the letters of Bereshit and break them apart and make an anagram of them, and this is something you find in the Zohar, it spells out wanting song.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
Whoa. Okay,
So
good.
in other words, if you want to extrapolate now to the much duller level of a sentence, God created the world out of a desire for song. So yeah.
Okay, so what's the Hebrew when you make the anagram, when you scramble the letters and rearrange them? What's the Hebrew?
It's ta'ev shir. Ta'ev shir. So it's like b'teavon, appetite.
Yeah.
So desiring song is probably maybe a closer craving song even. Yeah, there's a couple of different ways you can vocalize that, and it would just change the tense, but that's the basic Zoharic take on it. Is what does Bereshit mean? A desire for song. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've just blown my mind. It's
Yeah.
going to totally change the way I read Torah for the rest of my life, I think.
See, the thing is that I think when I started out as a young poet and as a Jew, American Jew, went to Jerusalem, and the Kabbalistic stuff began to sort of trickle down into me through different channels. I was pretty suspicious of all this. What is this mumbo jumbo, the shell game of all this. But of course, over time you say, no, actually, that's the way I listen to English. I hear constant other possibilities. People say something, and I'm always hearing something parallel to it, other permutations. And it's not that I'm not paying attention. I am listening to them. I'm listening really hard, just like Jeffrey in some ways. But it makes the world more interesting. It makes the world richer, and it's there. It's there. And we register that in different ways. So, yeah, I mean, but I am aware of the possible shell game dimension to it. So, and I try to encode that into my poems too. Some of the slippage, the kind of ironic slippage of it.
Yeah. This kind of leads, at least in my thinking, quite naturally to the next poem in the Terry Winter series, because it's another poem where I felt like there were some traces of, or like hints, Kabbalistic hints in this poem. And I'll let you tell me like I'm completely, misreading it, but there are a number of poems in which you talk about the nothing and things emerging from the nothing. And I think about the poem Ayin on the Hebrew letter Ayin, and I think that's the first letter Ayin in the word Ein, from like Ein Sof, the limitless, the without end. Or maybe that's an aleph and not an aleph.
That's an aleph. But
That's an aleph. Okay, so forget about that one.
But that kind of homonym is itself interesting.
Yeah. And aim, like there is no, right? From anyway, let's go on to poem number 7, and let's see if what I was like detecting as some passing Kabbalistic hints or references are actually there in the poem.
Okay, I'll read the poem, but let me just say that again, as with all these things, like you don't need to know any of the Kabbalistic stuff. It's fun to go back in afterwards and talk.
Yeah.
Ezra Pound talked about the way in which you know something when it begins to percolate in you, and you don't actually remember where it came from even. And that's the way this stuff is working with me now. It's only there because it's deeply in me and been in me for a long time. It's never off, I'm gonna take this color off the shelf, this Kabbalistic color, put in a little, cadmium Kabbalah red, or it's not like that. It's they just emerge, they sort of surface. So sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, but it doesn't. I'm responding to in this case to an artwork and to a mood. In this case, I'm also responding to my own particularly not exactly uplifting mood at the moment of writing. Okay, so it goes like this.
Okay, wait. Can I
Yeah.
stop you read the poem and just ask,
Yeah.
one question, which so with the Hebrew poets of Muslim Spain, for instance, did they have a similar experience that the knowledge of the texts of prophets, of psalms, of liturgy, of Torah, or whatever, was just so deeply embedded in them that they weren't intentionally and consciously thinking about, oh, let me draw on this verse from here and juxtapose it to this verse from over there, that it was more just part of their being and way of being.
Mm-hmm. That's a great observation. A little of both, in the sense of, yes, they were basically writing self-consciously in a biblical vocabulary, because that was, well, for complicated reasons, we'll go into that. So everything they were doing is a kind of instinctive drawing on what they've been living with since they were 3 years old.
Yeah.
But of course, there were times where they're explicitly drawing on specific passages and changing the meaning of them, possibly. And so there they would want a reader to know, and that would be like a much more full-fledged kind of allusion, the same way we are familiar with that in modern literature. And so I do that sometimes too. But because the body of knowledge that I'm drawing on when it comes to Jewish things is not available to most readers, I can't assume that knowledge, and therefore I will bury them. I want them to work on their own terms. Wallace Stevens, my favorite sort of stick to pull out all the time these days, is in his Man with the Blue Guitar. He says, say what it is that you see in the dark, that it is that, or that it is this, but do not use the rotted names. I mean, I've got that. It's just sort of up on the wall of my mind all the time. And so things will come in, images from a body of literature, let's say, that I can assume my readers don't have. I just have to be aware that I can, it can enter as a foreign agent or influence, but I can't assume any knowledge, and I don't want to assume any knowledge. But it doesn't mean that they're not there. So then we can talk about. Okay. The other thing with the medieval things that I wanted to say is, when I began to translate medieval Hebrew poetry from Spain, so Andalusia, 10th, 11th, 12th century, one of the key things for me, the thing that really unlocked that literature for me more than anything else, was looking at the visual art of the period and reading modern scholars on the visual Islamic art of the period. And that analog, the power of that comparison and that switchover has stayed with me really powerfully. So in a way, yes, that's what I'm doing here. Got another translation of all that.
Beautiful. Okay, on to the poem. Sorry that I interrupted you.
That's all right. In arc so dark it glows with its holding, the nothing it knows within its unfolding, composes now a hardening sparks, unhidden power, unbidden black, in diamond white as softening graphite crystal flaking gently breaks into an opaque night of fluorescence over a field behind a fence where a king's thinking of slipping tenses and the ancient art of riding wakes, or maybe only a day's mistakes. Here at the pointed end of a pencil from a parcel, and that's a start, as ink shines in the king's heart. Your turn.
No turn. When I first read this poem, I immediately grabbed my notebook and copied out, as ink shines in the king's heart. I don't know that I have anything to say about that other than it registered so deeply in me that I just had to write it down and hold on to it and want to keep it. It's something felt, powerfully just right there. Of course, the words lock together with the shared and echoing sounds. And so anyway, so I just wanted to say that about the
Yeah.
last.
Well, thank you for that. And that's, for me, that's all I want at some level. Because once it's in you, in the same way that the drawing was in me, in this case here, you can see the drawing. That's the way poems are for us. We have them in us, the poems that matter to us in one way or another. They're in us, and sometimes we don't actually understand exactly what they mean. Their meaning, their being between, in between, that kind of meanness. And that also is, there's a kind of powerful meaning that comes long before the ability to articulate it, or as Gertrude Stein says, to put it in other words.
Yeah, and why would one want to do that?
Right.
Such an incredible line or two. And so, I mean, I see the play with darkness and light in here. The movement, unless I'm, missing it, from night to day. I see this arc here at the beginning of the poem, and for me, it calls to mind, Noah's Ark and many other kinds of arcs, I guess. This holding the nothing it knows. Oh boy, since you just mentioned Stevens, I think about the Snowman poem. And just the turning and turning and turning, as in so many of these poems. An arc so dark it glows, just like an ink shining at the end of the poem. An arc so dark it glows, with its holding the nothing it knows within its unfolding, holding and unfolding. These processes that seem opposed to one another, that are actually happening together. And then, when I got to that spark thing, with the nothing it knows, I was thinking about creation ex nihilo, or, and when I got to the hardening sparks, I was thinking about the Kabbalistic ideas, I guess the Lurianic ideas of these sparks from the shattered vessels. Again, something that no one else needs to know. I was very surprised when a king showed up here toward the end of the poem, and still I'm not quite sure. I reread this poem last night and a couple of times this morning, still not quite sure to make of this king that just seems like to come from another era, from another culture. And yet I also started to think about king in relation to a divine figure, a godlike figure, but maybe not necessarily.
Or just in relation to thinking.
Yeah, yes.
Thinking.
Yeah.
The infra-thin king of
thinking. Ooh, yeah, thinking, beautiful. So anyway, I don't have anything coherent to say other than that I was deeply moved by this poem, especially its ending.
Thank you. I mean, I also feel that in some ways, the less said, the better. I will say that it was written out of a desire to confront darkness, darkness that was very personal for me at the time. But it's in this drawing, but it's also inside the darkness is, and this is also a Zohar thing, but it's also a Terry Winters thing, who's not thinking about the Zohar. There's tremendous power in that darkness, and a kind of glowing, and it's only by going into the darkness that you have a chance of getting anything out from that and returning.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I mean, I'm sorry you went through this period of terrible darkness, but I think that just comes with being a human.
Exactly.
Living
Exactly.
within this body. So we're just about out of time. And though I'd love to continue this conversation forever, but no one would want to listen to it forever. Maybe they would. But I think we should conclude with a poem. And I know that you and I had been in conversation a little bit and thought about maybe turning to What the Beard Said, part 3, but maybe there's a different poem you feel at the moment you'd like to conclude with.
That's complicated because I mean, I could read the first poem in the book, one thing, so on, but I've never read this What the Beard Said. It's What the Beard Said 3. I think it will actually continue out what we've talked about. It's on page 102. So there's What the Beard Said 1, and there's What the Beard Said 3. There is no What the Beard Said 2, and that's also part of the I missed that one, right? Maybe the beard was speaking. And this is also a visual poem in the sense, but no one knows it. There's also in Kabbalistic lore, there's this thing called Ilanot. They're like, Ilanot means trees, but they're Kabbalistic diagrams. They're actually diagrams of divine consciousness. It's as close as we get to sort of Jewish art that's not just kind of kitschy illuminated manuscripts. And they're crazy. I mean, they're really wild. And one of the motifs is the beard of God, God's beard. And you look at these things, and at first you say, "What? Give me a break!" But I spent a lot of time looking into those drawings, and here's one of the poems that emerged from it. Awesome. What the Beard Said 3. What the Beard Said 3 is just now beyond me, softly, as a kind of mercy. Here within the fat book saying that to ascends, in fact, to sink into the heart of what's on high, beginning with what's right in front of our eyes and ears, above all else, or else beneath them, when they're close to being closed, to dying, to the world we go now. It isn't so hard to imagine something coming from nothing, and not for nothing, as they say, it might just be your lucky day. Or maybe someone else's nothing come to something, or something to naught, is what I thought I heard there in what the beard softly seemed to be saying.
Wow. I don't want to take away from the power of that poem by saying anything about it, other than to say, as I hear it now in the context of this conversation, it feels like a perfect poem on which to reach our and.
Great. That's wonderful.
I hope that our conversation will continue. Peter, your conversation.
It will, for sure.
And I want to thank you for so many things, including spending this hour with us and sharing your work and your thoughts with the Black Mountain College community. And I want to thank you for years of friendship and for years of being a teacher of mine, I've never formally been a student of yours, but I've been a student of your work for many
you.
years.
The feeling is mutual, and thanks for these great questions. I mean, that was really wonderful to hear your reading, your take on some of these poems. It's completely surprising and enlightening and opening.
Great. Well, thanks. So be well. Thank you all for listening and viewing this wonderful conversation with Peter Cole. And if you are interested in seeing, hearing more of the conversations, performances, and talks that are part of the Faith and Arts Project, please visit our website, blackmountaincollege.org. Take care.